Evening, one and all. I am Abhinandita, your host for this lecture, and you'll have to bear with me for just a little while. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, which is our humble attempt to transform subaltern studies in little ways, it is our heartfelt honor to welcome you all to today's much anticipated lecture titled From Women to Gender and Back Again, Revisiting the Making of Indian Nation. Professor Mrinalini is one of the foremost historians of modern South Asia and the British Empire, whose pioneering scholarship has shaped fields of gender history, post-colonial studies, and transnational historiography. She currently holds the position of Alice Freeman Palmer Professor of History at the University of Michigan, where she also serves as professor in the departments of English and Gender Studies. Professor Sinha is widely known for her works such as Colonial Masculinity, the Manly Englishman, and the Effeminate Bengali, where she brings into light the juxtaposed perspectives of the two. On one hand existed the trained for nothing, ready for anything Britain, and on the other hand existed the Bengali Babu, viewed as effeminate, bookish, and leisurely. Dr. Sinha in her book connects these contrasting stereotypes to the development of watershed movements such as the Ilbert Bill, the Public Service Commission, and the revision of the age of consent. Then comes her phenomenal work Sectors of Mother India, where she traces and deconstructs the ramifications of Catherine Mayow's Mother India and talks about a distinct liberal feminist identity born within the tensions of the colonial rule and the semantic struggle of the competing conceptions of state and society. Dr. Sinha writes in her essay Refashioning Mother India, and I quote, "Nowhere perhaps was Indian feminism more transformative than in offering the modern Indian woman as herself, the prototype of the modern Indian citizen." As she reflects upon the leading women's organizations in India backed by the nationalist demand for universal adult suffrage. Her works, thus, as you can very well see, have defined how we understand colonial discourse, nationalism, and gender, and the global dimensions of anti-colonial resistance. Her contributions have been recognized through numerous honors, including a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and invitations to deliver prestigious lectures all over the world. In 2024, she delivered the Ursula Hirschman Lecture at the European University Institute, reflecting on 5 decades of scholarship at the intersection of gender and colonialism. Today, we welcome you, ma'am. We are honored to welcome Professor Mrinalini Sinha, whose work exemplifies a deep commitment to the decolonizing historical narratives. I end on a note from Bama's Karukko. She seeks an identity, but she seeks a change which means an end to that identity. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Abhinandita. That was such a beautiful and lovely introduction. I wish I could tape that and keep that with me and remind me of, the ways in which one's work gets received by people. That was really humbling and beautiful. I also want to thank Pala Beragia, who invited me for this talk, and to all of you from the Voices from the Periphery for putting this together. It's an amazing initiative. I noticed that I'm the 66th lecture in your series. That's so wonderful. Congratulations to all of you for putting this together. And of course, thank you to all of those of you who've signed up for this lecture. I know there are lots of ways you could be spending your Monday evening. And so I am happy to see that you're here, and I hope we can have a conversation around some of the things I'd like to talk about today. Before I start my talk formally, I want to offer 2 caveats just so that we are prepared for what to expect. The first is that I've decided to eschew a PowerPoint presentation today. I did start making one and then decided that I would go without it because I was hoping to think of this talk more as a conversation with more interaction rather than as a lecture where I'd be talking at you. And so you will notice in my format, do a lecture but also encourage participation in between, not just at the end of the talk, but even in the middle. Often that is more conducive to some of the kind of things that I want to talk about today. The second caveat that I want to make is Some of you might find parts of what I have to say familiar, and I apologize for that because I am trying to revisit some earlier work and also survey a field of scholarship in order to make a new argument about the direction of that scholarship. So I'm hoping that even though some parts will be familiar, you will see what is different and what is new in the kind of argument I want to make about the scholarship. So my argument basically is fairly simple. What I am trying to argue today is that, in the 1980s, the scholarship on nationalism moved from a focus on women to a focus on gender. And what I want to argue that maybe today in the 21st century, it might be time to revisit a return to a focus on women, but this time with a different perspective, with different sets of assumption. So that's my basic argument. And it stems from this argument of wanting to go back to a focus on women after this kind of shift from women to gender that occurred in the 1980s is in part due to thinking about the place of feminist historiography within the mainstream historiography of South Asia. And I want to suggest that there's something pretty unusual about it. It's a puzzle. And one of the things I want to do with you is to work through what this puzzle is. And what I'm calling a puzzle is this fact that feminist historiography emerged around the same time in the 1980s, a new feminist historiography. There was feminist historiography before then, but a new kind of feminist historiography emerged in the 1980s around the same time as other major historiographical developments took place. The subaltern studies, the early modern school of Indian historiography that focused on rethinking the 18th century and then subsequently, from roughly the 16th century to the 18th century. Both these forms of historiography, subaltern studies, early modern, have now subsequently had lots of anthologies written about their impact, their implications for the study of South Asian historiography. But feminist historiography hasn't had that same recognition yet. Even though it hasn't had that same recognition, though it emerges around the same time and challenges the field in lots of interesting ways as well. So it hasn't had that recognition, yet many of its insights, many of its contributions have sort of spread across the field without necessarily acknowledging them as contributions coming out of this third kind of historiographical revolution that happened in the 1980s that I'm calling the new feminist historiography. And I think some of my argument about the return to women is kind of a response to this uneven reception of feminist historiography. And I'm thinking here of a scholar like Janaki Nair, who kind of puts it very interestingly. She says that feminist historiography's contributions had a lateral spread. They spread across the various subfields of South Asian historiography, but they did not necessarily get acknowledged as an independent project, and they didn't get engaged by scholars in the same way as some of the other fields did. Now, as you can guess already by now, that my talk today is mainly historiographical, so it's not going to be necessarily a development of a particular history, but really about historiographical developments in the field. And if you are anything like my students at the University of Michigan, I know students hate historiography. So bear with me. I think there is an important role to play in engaging with historiography and mapping the field, seeing what have been its contributions, its challenges, and seeing where it could be going. And I think thinking about Indian nationalism and the making of the Indian nation is a particularly apt place to kind of map this kind of historiography that I've been talking about. So let me then get back to my topic, which is this argument about from women to gender and back again, revisiting the making of the Indian nation. I want to kind of start with a very important book that came out in 1986. And this is by Sri Lankan feminist writer Kumari Jayawardena, a book called Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World that had a chapter on India, just as it did in other parts of the world. Now, what was interesting about this book is that it took the relationship between feminism and nationalism very seriously. And it was making an argument that this relationship was very distinctive of countries in the third world. And this kind of distinguished them from nationalisms elsewhere. So it raised a very interesting, broader question about the nature of nationalisms in colonized countries and about its investment with issues of gender and women through engagement with feminism. It's not that before Jayawardena's work, there were not books about women and nationalism in India. There certainly were. There was a long history of scholarship trying to document the role of women in the history of anti-colonial nationalism. Most of these were what we could call histories of inclusion, histories of the contribution of women to nationalism rather than an attempt to rethink nationalism itself. So, in that sense, it was more directed at self perceptions, it more directed at people who were interested in the topic. So, it was easy to ghettoize some of that scholarship. That this is, if you were interested in women, then you looked at this work, but if you were just interested in nationalism, it was not necessarily of interest to you. But a number of things happened around the time Jayawardena's book was published that would kind of change the context in which that book would land and would change the way scholarship would develop henceforth. The first thing that happened was a rethinking of nationalism itself. And I'm associating this most notably with another famous book, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Community, that kind of forced scholars, published in 1983, that forced scholars to really think about nationalism more capaciously, the more cultural aspects of nationalism. So opening up the field a little to different kinds of considerations than had been the kind of earlier focus on the high politics of nationalism. Around the same time, and in 1989, we had two really powerful books on South Asian feminist historiography published, and I'm talking of Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Ved's Recasting Women and J. Krishnamurthy's Women in Colonial India. Now, both these books were kind of mapping out a new kind of feminist historiography, one in which the concern was not so much just with including women or talking about women's contributions, but really one that wanted to think about how all of reality, all of history was actually gendered. So these scholars were kind of making not only making a distinction between gender, the social construction of perceived differences between the sexes, they were not only kind of making a distinction between the social construction of perceived sexual differences and biological sex, but they were also making an argument about using gender as an analytical category, of really thinking of how you could use this concept to understand and unpack a variety of things about class formation, community formation, caste formations, economic, political, social life more broadly. So this was a moment that would kind of change the way in which scholarship would proceed. If this was more the internal changes that were happening within historiography, the 1980s also saw a series of cultural revivalist movements outside of historiography in the larger world across various South Asian nations, where various movements were attempting to develop what they considered an authentic Indian or Hindu identity. And so you can think of this moment around the sort of controversy around Rup Kanwar Sati in 1987, and various people trying to glorify that Sati as really authentic Indian tradition that had been kind of challenged or rebuked by colonial or colonial-minded Indians in the past. We also see this around the Shah Banu case, when in 1986 you get the judgment of the Indian government on the Muslim Women's Protection to Divorce Act, which sort of also kind of becomes important because it kind of asserts the importance of women for the understanding of a collective Muslim identity. So all of these events, I mean, both internally within the historiography itself, the changes in nationalism, nationalist historiography, the changes in feminist historiography, as well as externally, the political situation in South Asia, made this a very ripe moment for rethinking how we study nationalism more broadly. And I think one of the things that the scholarship did was, within almost a decade of Jayawardena's Feminism and Nationalism, which seemed like an inaugural precursor, within a few decades of that, we start getting a scholarship that kind of takes as granted that nations are gendered constructs, that all nations and nationalisms are necessarily gendered. So a remarkable shift has happened in accepting that. And here, gender is seen as something that is both constitutive of social relations based on the perceived differences between the sexes, but also gender as a means of kind of articulating and enforcing a wide range of social relations of power beyond that bit of men and women. So this concept has become, within a decade of the 86 publication, much more common and pro forma in a lot of the scholarship. But there is a puzzle, and that's what I'm wanting to address. And that puzzle is that even as it has become natural to think of nations as gendered, in actual fact, we see this acceptance, both within feminist scholarship and non-feminist scholarship, has not necessarily meant a real engagement with the fuller contributions that feminist scholarship has been engaged in and has attempted to address. And I think that unease with both the sort of acceptance of many of the contributions, but the rejection of the overall project or the acknowledgement of its goals, is what I want to kind of tease through with you in my talk today. And what I will do is think of my talk as divided into two parts. So the first part, I want to focus on just kind of reviewing what are some of the major contributions, major implications of this widespread acceptance that the concept of gendered nation makes sense, that, nations are inherently gendered. This widespread acceptance, what has that meant? What have been its contributions? And then in the second part of the talk, I want to focus on what have been the limits of it. What are the reasons why that is not enough, and why it might be necessary to go back, but in a different way, to the focus on women from the period before the 1980s, before this shift happened. I should mention that, of course, I'm aware that nations and nationalisms still, there's lots of debate about their definition, about their origins, about their nature, and I'm not going to get into all of those differences right now. I also acknowledge that there are many kinds of nationalisms. They have different spatial, temporal, political scopes in different localities, different regions, and also different groups, different collectivities have their own nationalisms. I'm not going to get into that difference either. Even if we were to think of something like mainstream anti-colonial nationalism, the official nationalism associated with something like the Indian National Congress, even that is not one thing. We know scholarship has shown that changes over time. It changes across spaces and different areas. It looks very different. And it also has its own contradictory elements. But that also is not what I'm going to go into today. But I think without flattening this notion that nationalisms appear very differently in different contexts and there are different kinds of nationalism, without flattening that difference, I think one can still argue and identify certain sort of dominant strands of the contribution, both methodological and substantive, that gender has made to the study of nationalism. And I think it could be seen in that broader light without necessarily flattening it. So I am now going to pivot to kind of those two parts. The first, what the contributions have been of the scholarship on gender and nationalism, and then second, the limits and the need for us to go beyond that and maybe even return in a different way, not identical, to the earlier concerns with the question of women. But before I go any further, maybe I'll pause and see if people have any questions, concerns, comments, talking too fast, talking too slow, anything that I can benefit from.
Uh, Anybody, if you have any questions, if not, I think we can proceed.
Yep, absolutely. No problem. No problem at all. I like to pause sometimes, and I know that on online platform, it's always a little intimidating asking that question or being the first one to do that. I know, Abhinandita, there is a way in which people can also type in questions, right? Oh, okay,
Yeah,
great.
all
So
of
that
you,
should,
you can type your questions in the message box if you don't want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
yeah. So absolutely. So that's even great. And then can I look at those questions simultaneously, or would you have to send it
Yeah,
to me?
yeah, absolutely. If you look at your the right corner of your screen, there is this chat sort of a symbol.
Okay.
There's a people
Okay.
symbol,
Yeah.
and there's a
Yep,
yeah,
I see that. Okay,
yeah.
so great. So I'll monitor that as well. So please feel free to stop me, ask me to repeat something, or raise a question, and I'd be happy to get to that. Okay, okay. So then let's look at first the question of the ways in which gendered scholarship has really questioned, has really contributed to a rethinking of the way in which we study nationalism of all kinds, and taking into account the variations that I mentioned a minute ago. I would say that there are two sort of main contributions it's made. And those two contributions are ways in which they together have really expanded the understanding of what we think of as political, what is political about nationalism. And I think those two contributions are first, the way in which the scholarship has realigned the domestic or the private with the public and the political. So that's one main contribution, and I'll break that down in a minute as we go along. And the second contribution I think that it's made is to take the question of gender often associated with the domestic. So this is in a way an opposite move to the first. So the first is to align the domestic or the private with the political and the public in very interesting ways. The second is to take the question of gender away from the domain of the domestic and to put it squarely in the domain of the public. And I think those two almost seemingly contradictory, but actually, I think, very complementary moves have been perhaps the most significant contributions of the scholarship on gender and its contribution to the scholarship on nationalism. So let's look at the first, the question of realigning the domestic or the private with the public and the political. In some ways, this has been a concern of feminist historiography for a long time. They've argued for long before this kind of moment of nationalism becoming mainstream, have argued for thinking about the family not necessarily as a private thing or mainly just familial, but to think of households as very deeply implicated, especially in the pre-colonial and in the pre-modern period, with larger political, economic, and social forces. I mean, the most prominent example, of course, is the role of elite households, royal households, in dynastic succession and in sort of consolidating certain forms of governance. So we can think of scholarship on this, especially from the early modern period, for example, the Mughal household, but going back into the pre-modern period more broadly. So that's been always a concern of a lot of feminist scholarship on the family, that the family was never this privatized thing. And the second thing that they'd argued was that even that privatization, when that happens at the family, where it is sort of separated from the public, where you get this notion of women at home and men in the world, that even at the height of that moment, a moment created by both colonial efforts, but also the appropriation of those ideas by indigenous elites themselves, that even at the height of that idea, feminist scholarship has shown that these were mainly ideological. They were not in actual fact. So there was much more connection between the domestic and the public than we have given it credit for. And it really was particular political and economic forces that enabled us to even think about these two areas as separate. So this had been a long-standing concern in feminist scholarship itself, but what would change is how this would become a more mainstream kind of recognition, especially in the case of nationalism, that this separation was no longer tenable, that we needed to see them as connected. Because if you think of the earlier scholarship on nationalism, there was a similar, this public-private division was mapped onto the scholarship itself. So there was a way in which scholars who studied nationalism studied, political organizations like the Indian National Congress, while the domestic was often left to this area of what we called social reform. It was there that people studied questions of religion, of gender, of caste. It was all part of social reform literature. And in many ways, the historical institutions also mapped that separation. So you had the Indian National Congress representing political movements, while you had the National Social Conference, formed only 2 years after the Indian National Congress in 1887, representing the social movement. And then the scholarship would argue that it was under a leadership like Gandhi's of the mainstream movement that the two would finally come together. So even though the history mapped that division, people did recognize there was a connection between the two. And the real contribution of gendered scholarship was to make that connection much more visible and much more integral, not see them as separate, but really see the question of social reform as very much a part of the entire political project of anti-colonial nationalism. So let's see how they did that. The first was just reopening the so-called women's question, which was the focus of a lot of social reform scholarship. Now, the question that comes up is, why did social reformers focus on the women's question? And especially the question of upper caste Hindu women, not on the caste question, for example, or on other questions about women, their economic participation or contribution, but it became focused on particular traditions reserved for upper caste women and upper caste Hindu women. That in itself raised made us aware that the women's question was never neutral, that if the women's question dominated the social reformers' psyche for so long, from all kinds of levels of leadership, national, local, provincial, regional, that if it did, it was saying something. And what it was saying was that it was very closely tied to the class caste formation of the reformers themselves, who were so interested in the kind of women's question that would become so prominent, because the kind of family that they were wanting to create or reform was a particular kind of family that focused on conjugality, for example, that did not focus on the traditional co-parsonary household of the past, that focused on the dyad between husband and wife rather than the larger family. Now, that is showing us a class formation that requires this sort of family formation for a new kind of property regime for professional and business class people emerging under in this period under the colonial regime. So women's question in that sense was never just about women. It was always about class caste formations that were integral to it. And of course, the most famous example of this recognition of the broader implication of the women's question is the work of Lata Mani on the self-immolation of widows, Sati Daha, also known as Sati, where we see and in her famous argument, the debate about sati is not making women either the objects or the subjects of this reform. They are really the grounds, as she puts it famously, for debating different views of tradition. So since then, there have been lots of criticisms of her earlier formulation. People have taken that scholarship in different directions. But the basic point that she was making still holds, and that is that very often the women's question is really not about women themselves, it is about other issues. And I think that kind of enable scholars to kind of see a much greater connection between that so-called social reform, which was in its own area, and then the political nationalism that was seen in a separate area. There were also other spill-out effects of social reform scholarship that had implications for thinking about anti-colonial nationalism. So if you think of the background against which social reform scholarship work was happening in India was against this sort of codification of personal laws or religious laws under the colonial regime based on religious traditions and customs of discrete groups, which meant that a lot of the social reform was also about creating sort of homogenous denominational communities as Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and other groups. Of course, it was never smooth. There were always questions and challenges within that. But the overall tendency over the years was to kind of create these fixed communities that both enabled certain kinds of nationalism around these communities, but also limited other kinds of nationalism across these communities. And we see that in various kinds of legislation. So the two most famous examples are, of course, the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act, for example of 1856, that gave upper caste women who didn't have the right to remarry, it allowed them to remarry. But in doing so, in allowing those women to remarry, it also restricted their access to their dead husband's property. Now, what this meant is once this act was formed, even caste groups that never had any restrictions against widow remarriage, they married, widows remarried, and they retained rights to the property of their dead husbands. Now, all of a sudden, they were no longer able to have access to that because there was this one notion of Hindu widow remarriage that was created. You see similar kinds of moves with legislative reforms among Muslims, where you see an increasing Islamicization of Muslim law, so that marriage practices or inheritance practices of certain groups of Muslims, like the Khojas, the Momens, the Mapilas, those get marginalized for this one kind of understanding of Islam and Islamic law. So you get sort of these sharper divisions between denominational communities, which, as I say, both reinforced national identifications within communities, but also make cross community connections much harder. Apart from that, we also see how social reform issues, and I'm thinking here of the work of somebody like Tanika Sarkar, how social reform issues were so central, is a part of the public sphere debates, whether it was in print, in journals, in plays and music and in painting, that a lot of issues from the home were what people argued and debated about in public, whether it was the scandalous murder of an adulterous Hindu wife that led to all kinds of debates about family and colonial laws and modernity, etc., or whether it was debates around whether women should be, with the age of sexual consent for women and the Age of Consent Act should be raised or not. A lot of political leaders would use that as a sort of attempt to revive a certain kind of idea of Hindu community, Hindu culture, in which it was based on kind of denying Hindu women their freedom, but asserting male freedom in keeping those practices against the colonial state. And in fact, as Sarkar argues, it is this contradiction between wanting freedom against the colonial state, but denying freedom to women in this debate around the Age of Consent Act on raising the age for sexual intercourse, that a lot of the nationalist rhetoric in Bengal shifts from a focus on the Hindu wife. Until then, the focus was on the Hindu wife to the Hindu mother, the idea of glorifying the mother, because that contradiction between freedom and unfreedom in the relationship between men and their wives was sort of sublimated a little in the glorification of the mother. So you see public discourse around gender, around domestic issues, provided the topics, the techniques, the methods that nationalist leaders would adopt in relation later to the colonial state as well. And of course, the most famous example of that is Partha Chatterjee's argument about how the inner spiritual sphere was the real place, the origin of Indian nationalism. That unlike in other places, the origin is not in the public political organizations. It really originates in the inner, what he calls the inner spiritual sphere that dealt with questions of women, of caste, of religion, that it is there that nationalists first asserted the idea of their community and how their community was both derivative or dependent upon the West, but also different from the West. It is this kind of mental separation of the inner and spiritual versus the outer and material that enabled the start or the origins of Indian nationalism. And so to just kind of recall his argument, he's saying the only way one could create this idea of a national imagination that was really modern but was also Indian was to work with this dichotomy. And in this dichotomy, you could accept Western rule or derivative nature in the outer material sphere, but in the inner sphere, you remained authentic and sovereign and pure. And of course, this did not mean that these nationalists were saying, we don't want to reform gender relations. They did continue to reform gender relations, but they did so under their own understanding. They did so under their own interests and own terms. They didn't want to make it a question of debate with the colonial state. Now, again, Chatterjee's rather schematic view of inner and outer has come up for lots of criticism by feminist scholars and others in terms of, its applicability across places beyond Bengal, its applicability across time, when different groups kind of emerge and take over the question of women's reforms. Also, the possibility of thinking about how Dalits or women themselves don't see the need to distinguish modernity in this inner outer way, but they claim their originality even in the outer material sphere, unlike these male nationalists. So there have been lots of criticisms of that work, but still, I think his basic idea that nationalism is inherently invested in this privatized sphere remains true, and it helps us explain the working of a variety of different kinds of nationalisms in the South Asian context. I mean, the most famous, of course, is Gandhi. Why is he invested in the quotidian aspects of everyday home life? Like, why would he make khadi, spinning, or salt, something that you use in the kitchen, as the basis of his movements, but also why he would focus so much on mobilizing women in the nationalist movement itself. So that's, of course, the most famous example, but you see that in others. So if you think of the Tamil speaking region in India and the self respect movement, here, a reformer like Periyar, even as he becomes critical of Gandhian nationalism, is also really invested in gender relations for Dravidian nationalism. So, they reject the kind of ritual form of marriage and want a kind of different kind of non ritualized self respect marriage. So it helps understand why these nationalisms remain so invested in this. Even Dalit reformers, for example, though they completely reject many upper caste norms and upper caste formulations of nationalism, you see, recognize that the status of Dalit women integrally tied to the status of the Dalit community. So questions about Dalit women's empowerment, about changing or reforming gender relations become so critical. So I think this investment of nationalism in this privatized domain has become much more accepted now than it had been before. The second part, where we see gender beyond the domain of the domestic, I will get to in a minute, but I just wanted to ask anyone again if people had any questions, concerns, slow down, pick it up. All okay?
I had
Ah,
one,
okay.
if
Thanks,
possible.
Unnati. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Abhinandita.
You were talking about Gandhi and the intersection of the domestic sphere with the public and social reform thereby. But when we talk about such, what about the bias held by these social reformers, especially men like Gandhi, who, if you read their autobiography, we get to know their prejudice against women. So, what about that prejudice which exists in them bringing the domestic to the public?
Excellent question, Abhinandita, and I will get to that a little bit more as later as well. But what I would say is that one of the things that this investment in the private makes clear is it's not meant to be emancipating women. That's not the agenda. The agenda is they need women for their own purposes, and so they're also constraining. So they're concerned about reforming, right? So whether all of these nationalisms want to reform the positions of women, but they don't want to reform it to make it emancipatory necessarily. They're reforming it within their own understanding of what is proper. So to go back to Partha Chatterjee, it is like saying, I want a modern Indian woman as my wife. This modern Indian woman should be very different to the lower caste woman. She should also be very different to the traditional women of the past, but she should also be very different from the Western or westernized women, right? So in this case, what they're doing is they're limiting what changes can happen for women, but they're limiting it in a way that suits their purpose. So I'm not at all saying that this investment in the private is emancipatory, but it is true that what they're doing is doing it for their own purpose. So you really hit the nail on the head. And I see there's another question. Do you agree with Partha Chatterjee's idea that the women's question was resolved in nationalist discourse? Thank you, Aparna. That's another really great question. And I think, he would say that it's resolved in the sense that women will um, we don't need to have a debate with the colonial government about it. We'll debate it among ourselves. So Partha Chatterjee, when he was saying it was resolved, he was responding to an earlier scholarship that said that In the early 19th century, Indian men were really into reforming women's position. But in the late 19th century, they ignored women's thing completely. And this was when they said, we don't want the colonial state to interfere with our women's position at all. Now, Chatterjee is saying that it really wasn't that they were not interested in the women's question. They necessarily were interested in the women's question, but they didn't want to discuss it with the colonial state. So it was resolved in the sense they all agreed that we need to kind of reform it, but they didn't agree on with other groups and the extent of the reform to take place. So going back to Abhinandita's question. But most scholars now would say that it's never really resolved because it's not that women were just happily saying, okay, let men decide how much reform we need. A lot of times women were, and we now have enough evidence, they were questioning that, they were pushing against that. So the resolution was in the male's perception of it, but certainly not in history. So in that sense, it's never entirely resolved. It has to continuously be negotiated and renegotiated. And to give Partha Chatterjee credit, he has now an essay in response to the criticism where he agrees that yes, it's not a one-time resolution, it's a constant rethinking. Another question from Abhinaba: how does Sumiti Ramaswamy's work on the spatial body of nation as mother contribute to the national agenda and preserving rather than emancipating women? Absolutely. Once again, Abhinaba, another really good example. So there too, we see how the gendered trope of women, nation as mother kind of works on exactly those grounds of sort of using women as symbols, as ways in which you construct a collective identity. So if Partha Chatterjee is talking about constructing a national identity, even though the focus for him is on Bengal, but one could argue that Bengal in the late 19th century was at the forefront of defining what the national identity would be. Sumiti Ramaswamy and other scholars would argue that, you find similar kinds of ways in which other groups, whether it's around Tamil language or Tamil nationalism, use women in precisely that way. Sudhan Ruda, when did women become a gender? That is such an excellent question again. It's interesting because in some ways, and people will often use gender as a synonym for women, that when people are talking about gender, they're actually really talking about women. It just becomes a hipper way to talk about women. But I think that's an unfair use of the term gender, because the reason initially in the 80s people started talking about gender is to say that gender is not about women. It's not a synonym for women. Gender really is about the perception of these differences between men and women. So men are as much gendered as women are, but we need to focus and make that more visible, and to think of this way of thinking about the world, that women and men produce different kind of identities, that this way of thinking about the world is often also used to think about other kinds of relationships. So, like in my earlier work on the effeminate Bengali, I don't talk about women. I'm talking mainly about men, but that same way in which you think about the relationship between men and women becomes a way of thinking about the relationship between the colonizer and the particular group of colonized, the middle class Bengalis who got characterized as effeminate. So yeah, that's how I would respond to that. Anish, you had a question. Did you want to raise your hand and go ahead?
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, my question was, ma'am, if we observe the history from ancient to medieval to modern times, the women community have been made the soft target of violence. If I just want to recently, I was reading a book, The Spectral Wound, written by Nanika Mukherjee, and there, when I was reading, ma'am, absolutely, I can't explain. So there, my question was, ma'am, why the women community, the ruling elite, or whoever is in power, they target the women community from the opposition group, and why the women were always vulnerable. Even if we observe. in the riots, in these religious pogroms also, the
Mm-hmm.
women they were the most vulnerable victims. Now, why this kept on taking place from ancient to medieval to modern and even postmodern also? Now, why the
Mm-hmm.
women
Mm-hmm.
community were being made the soft target? মানে I have searched to this each and
Okay.
every book, but I didn't get any satisfactory answer. Thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Not at all. Thank you. That was also a really good question, and it's something that I'm going to get to in a minute as well. But to just very briefly, I mean, it's an important question, hard to answer in a brief way, except to say that in a way, you're right that vulnerable groups, and often women are at vulnerable groups, have been targeted throughout history. But I think what may be difficult to say is that this group has been homogenous, meaning what we consider, I mean, even in ancient times, you have powerful women, right? And they are not often the objects of being targeted for violence. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. So even as we say there is a certain continuity in the targeting of women, I think history also teaches us that we need to historicize that. Like, when is it target? When do all women become seen as the same, versus when do some kind of women be seen, on the basis of their class, or caste, their religion, in very different ways. And I think one of the points about some of the scholarship on nationalism, and I'll come to that in a minute, has been to say that as women become more and more the basis of identity for a whole community, then the targeting of the women of that community becomes much more sort of homogenous in a way. So, for example, in ancient violence, you can imagine that, yes, women of a lower class would be treated, and of a lower caste, so-called lower caste, would be treated very differently than women of, the ruling elites, even if they are your opponent in a battle. They would be treated very differently than women of a different class. But what happens in the kind of communal violence we see around partition? That's not the case, where women of another community becomes just a symbol of your enemy community. Whether they're rich or poor becomes less significant. But we'll come to that. I think it's a really good question to both see the continuity, but also see that different historical moments give different understandings of this group that we are calling women. And another question I have from Rishika: the national discourse focused on preserving the ideals of an individual. Where do we then place the self-agency of a woman, or how do we understand the concept of self-agency? Great question, Rishika. And that's where I would say that a lot of the gendered scholarship and nationalism has been more focused on what the nationalists want of women, what they think should be this modern woman. They are both preserving, so-called preserving like ideals, but also changing those ideals, because they're not wanting, the ancient ideals completely. They're also changing it with the modern times. But the focus on the self-agency of these women is what often gets sort of forgotten, and that's where that uneven reception of feminist scholarship, while a feminist scholarship would want to emphasize that as well, I think some of that earlier work has not done that in the same way. Sumit Sarkar wrote in his critique of colonial India that Renaissance reformers were very selective in their, yeah, absolutely, Suchandra, they were very selective in certain ideas of liberal ideas that they accepted, others they did not. But that was very much part of making those reforms, those liberal ideas, their own. So this was not, their condition was not the same as what was happening in Europe. So when they wanted to create the modern Indian woman, they said, yes, we want her to have education. We want her to go outside and help the nation. But we don't want her to, say, for example, have short hair and smoke. I mean, this is just a kind of a trivial example, but basically it was that the reforms, the changes they were seeing, they were filtering it with their own understanding and their own priorities of what an Indian woman should be, rather than just generically copying something. So this again goes back to, it's derivative, but it's also different. It's not exactly the same. So let me quickly get to the second part of the contribution that they made. If the first part was to see the public very invested in the private, not emancipatory, but very invested in the private, that they couldn't do without thinking about the private. That was how we began to think of nationalism, that they were very concerned. This was not a minor issue that only women should be concerned about. The male reformers were obsessed about this women's question in a way. The second sort of point that I was making is to say that, so Harshini, I got your question and I'll come to that in a minute. The second part was where I was saying that how they also took the idea of gender beyond the domestic. So the first was to invest nationalism in domestic. The second is to take gender beyond the domestic. And we see that in the representations, and this is much more representational, of the territory, of the community, of the identity of a nation, that we see gender representations playing a really important part. We see that in the discussion of the nation as a community, as a motherland mainly, but even as a fatherland. So if you think of somebody like V.D. Savarkar, the ideologue of Hindutva, of Hindu nationalism, he spoke both of Matrubhumi, motherland, but also of Pitrubhumi, of fatherland. But by and large, it was the idea of mother, the Bharat Mata, that becomes that has been the subject of a lot of more scholarship than of the idea of the fatherland. And what this scholarship has done is it's made us see how nationalisms actually evoke this intimate passion, the same kind of passion that you would have for your mother. So the affective dimension. So nationalism is not just political, but it is this emotional, affective investment. It enables us to see how nationalism enters into our everyday lives once you kind of start thinking about nations in this familial term. Third, it also makes us question that once this nation, this Bharat Mata, also becomes like a mother goddess, how does the religious and the cross-religious or this non-religious, the secular kind of interact, the contradictions between thinking of the nation in those terms. But I think the question of representation, the thing that it's really allowed us to do is also to talk much more directly around issues of men as gendered beings, of masculinity, and making that more visible. So if in that first move that doesn't become so visible, the focus still remains on women a lot. I think in the second representational idea of taking gender outside of the home, in a way it also, or beyond the home, it also enables us to see the gendering of men and a masculinity in ways that we hadn't. So here I'm referring both to my earlier work where I kind of argued that the colonial state looked at middle-class Bengali men, Hindu men mainly, as effeminate, as the effeminate Bengali Babu. But when the Bengali Babus appropriated that, we have been made effeminate, they were also trying to make it as if all Indians are being treated as effeminate. So they're asserting their leadership of the nation. They're equating themselves with the nation as a whole. So that was part of a larger class formation, this assertion of effeminacy as an insult not just to this particular class, but to all Indians. Others have shown how this notion of masculinity and assertion of masculinity also led to sectarian conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So, for example, thinking of Charu Gupta's work on the United Provinces and northern India, how questions of Shuddhi, community defense, and conversion, and Sanghatan, community defense, was kind of mapped on to ideas of the virile and lustful Muslim. And so you got these tropes, these stereotypes of the Muslim male who's, about wanting to abduct or rape innocent Hindu women. So you got this, the way in which Hindu masculinity then had to be asserted by associating it with particular caste values, in particular Kshatriya caste values. So you see masculinity becoming as much part of this discourse about nationalism here. But I think it is around, and I think somebody raised the question earlier about violence, and I forget who it was, but it was, I think, around questions of violence that we see the discussion of masculinity at its most sophisticated in some ways, around questions of, say, the most egregious being the partition violence, but all kinds of communal or international, and I mean different kinds of nationalisms, violence against each other, where, the women of your community become people you protect. The our women, and the women of the other community are become, their women become people you violate. So you see during the partition violence a branding of women of different communities, with slogans on their body being inscribed Pakistan Zindabad, Hindustan Zindabad. So women become these people, fit to be violated, because what is being done in this is that, it's while the women are the subject of are subjected to violence, it is the men of the other community that you are targeting. You're humiliating the men of that community because they are unable to protect their women. And it's only in this context that you can understand how scholars like Urvashi Bhattalia, but Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin as well, have also indicated the different ways in which different kinds of women get impacted by this violence. So surprisingly, Bhattalia notices that during the partition violence, Dalit women, who ordinarily are subject to such an egregious violence, but during partition often escaped that kind of violence, because Dalit men were not considered to have the honor that you needed to humiliate the way in which you did to Muslim men, and Muslim men to Hindu men. So it kind of tells you how this trope of national honor works. I mean, I think the other thing they do is also kind of make a connection between this extreme violence that happens at a time of, events like partition, with the everyday violence that women experience at home. So a kind of continuum between them. And you see that especially when men often encourage interfamilial violence, killing of their own wives and daughters, so that they don't fall into the hands of the enemy. So here it is the honor of the community, the honor of men, that has to be protected by, killing their own women. So it's already showing you the continuum between the way in which women are thought of as basically bearers of honor rather than people with their own agency. Similarly, when women committed suicide, and we don't know whether they committed suicide because of their own volition or their family members forced them to. But when women committed suicide, they were often made into martyrs, that they were martyrs for the Hindu community or martyrs for the Muslim community. So here again, their own agency, like why they did commit suicide, were they doing it for the honor of the men of their community or for other reason? That becomes secondary. The real thing becomes male honor. So this bit, I think, has focused a lot more on questions of the ways in which nationalism is gendered, making men as much as women visible, which has been really useful. But of course, we cannot make an absolute correlation between the way in which these public scripts of male honor, national honor are discussed, and how it actually impacts individual beings. I mean, individual men and women may operate on very, very different scales. So I'm going to pause here to ask then my final question and then talk about why return to women. That if you think of these two modes as the major modes in which gendered nationalism has transformed the way we understand nationalism, the investment in the private, and then the recognition that gender operates beyond the home on questions that are of representation of the community, of the territory. If we recognize that these are the two major contributions, from a feminist perspective, there are also limits to these contributions. And the limits are, for example, that when we look at the investment of the public, national, in the domestic and the private, we often lose the dynamics of the domestic itself. That, how is that shaping things? Is the domestic important only because the nationalists are invested in it, or how do the dynamics of the domestic shape that? Also, and the question that came up from a number of you, what happens, or how do we think about the agency of women? That women, we can see, become objects of these nationalists and how they think they should be reformed and what should happen with them. But how do we really understand the agency of women, their own involvement? So it makes us recognize that there are major kind of developments and changes in the field, but some certain important questions about the marginalization of women in the scholarship still remains. And I think that's why a call now to say we need to go back to look at women and their agency in this, but not perhaps in the way we did before the 1980s, where we were simply interested in saying, hey, wait a minute, women were there, they contributed, they did this, they did that. We need to now look back at that by asking different kinds of questions. We're still wanting to make women more prominent and visible, focus on what they're doing, but do it in a very different way than we did in the past. So before I get to that last part, I just wanted to collect some last questions that I had here that I didn't get to answer. And I think there's one from Sohini. She said, I would rephrase a question raised in the chat to ask, when the question of women moved to the question of gender, did it really move out of the women's question? Much of what we consider as gender to gender has been about women's question. This makes me ask how we then think about the question of men and masculinity. If a return to women from gender happen now, how will that return undermine or enhance the question of masculinity? Terrific question, Sohini. I hope some of what I said addressed at least a little bit of it. But maybe not, and maybe the last part of how we return to women might address that what implication would that have for masculinity? I think it's a really great question, but if I don't address it in the second half, let me know and I'd be happy to come back to that, okay? But I think your point is well taken that yes, even when we switched the language from women to gender, a lot of people were using gender just simply as a new name for women. But as I've tried to show in both the moves on nationalism, the commitment to the private, yes, it focused much more on questions of women. But I think the focus on looking at nationalism and gender beyond the domestic did open up lots of questions of men and masculinity. It made us see how men and women are involved differently or implicated differently in their relationship to the nation. And so I think yours is a good question to say, what does it mean to now make a case, as I want to make, to say, let's go back to centering women much more in the debate on nationalism. Is it going to sort of change the way in which we have kind of brought attention to men and masculinity as also gendered beings? So good question. So if we look at the second part of my talk, which is the argument for the returning to women. One of the reasons I would argue that returning to women makes sense is that what has happened in the scholarship on gender nationalism, that we've got lots of material on gender, on both men and women as gendered beings, but what has still remained sort of under the radar is a question that some of you had asked earlier, is What about the agency of women? What does it mean to see women as more than just objects? Because in this, whether it is for male honor or whether it is for constructing a national identity, whether it's Dravidian, Tamil, Indian, Hindu, Muslim, that all of them kind of sort of center women as the basis for understanding their identity. That if that is the case, what about women's own agency in the scholarship, which seems to have been marginalized? And it has been marginalized, I think, partly incorrectly, because people often think of, okay, if you focus on women, then you're only going to focus on upper caste or majority Hindu women and not women of all different groups and kinds. And I think that's partly coming from a sort of Western scholarship, where it's true that, the initial focus of feminist scholarship was on women of dominant classes, and it was much later than feminists recognized the very different kind of histories of women of non-dominant groups. I want to suggest that in the Indian case, that was not the model, even though people use the non, and especially the Anglo-American case, as the model for India. That I don't think in the Indian case the focus was initially only on dominant women, women of the dominant communities, and then later on women of other places, of other communities. I think that was something that was a luxury that could not happen in the Indian case for a number of reasons. So let me argue that, and this time by returning to my work on Specters of Mother India, where I have suggested that it was a very difficult question of trying to create women as a unified political constituency. Any feminist mobilization needed to do that. But that could only happen if Hindu and Muslim and women of different religious communities were to say that even though the colonial state had kept us sort of divided into these different communities, the only way to create women as a community is to have cross-communal connections. So right from the beginning, the very first attempts to create something called a women as a constituency, as opposed to Hindus and Muslims, was efforts by women to work across religious communities. They also attempted to work across class and across caste. The last two were less successful, meaning they talked about it. They talked about being interested in the concerns of working class women. They talked about the interest, being interested in Dalit women, when in actual practice, the women's movement was much more limited in its encroachment, or in its approach to working class women and to lower caste women. They were more successful in the early years in being cross-religious, cross-communities until later. So the question is why, and I think it is because the circumstances for the emergence of women as a constituency in the West and in India was very different. In the West, women emerged as a constituency at a time when the public and the social was made up of individuals, and certain individuals, those who were made considered male, they were given certain rights while women were not. So that's how the idea of women as a constituency emerges. In the Indian context, on the other hand, there is not a focus in the social or in society on individuals. It is always on the basis of community. So then, when you want to constitute women, you have to constitute women as a community by working through these different communities. And that's what the early Indian feminists had to do. So they had to, unlike Western feminists, be very aware of the differences between women, because that was the reality they were dealing with. And then they had to kind of say, despite our differences, there's something that holds us together that makes us women. It was not an easy accomplishment. It took a lot of effort. It was a fraught one. It could easily be divided. They had some immediate success in that, in kind of constituting women like a community, as a one community across religious groups. And that success enabled them to say that in India, unlike in the West, it's not men who can stand up as a model citizen. It really is women who can stand up as model citizens, because they cut across this religious and class lines. But ironically, that very fact ended up being used against them, because the fact that women were unified in their initial demands were used against various minority communities, against Dalits, who were saying that we want in political sphere, we want special recognition, special representation because of our particular histories. Women were used as an example to beat on those communities, saying, why can't you be like women who are not demanding that? And that meant that whatever unity these women had created quickly broke down. And women of different communities, Dalit women, working class women, Hindu women, Muslim women, kind of a force to take the line of their communities. So, one of the things I had argued in that work is that what you get with women then is this, and with the history of Indian feminism, is this very difficult problem that in order to be a woman, you have to kind of break out of these communities and say there's something common across us. But that's an impossible thing to do, because you're also simultaneously an upper caste woman, a Hindu woman, a Dalit woman, a Muslim woman. So it is both the necessity of speaking outside the community, but the impossibility of going outside the community that remains the real problem of women, for feminists in India, which in a way arguably continues even today because of that particular history. I mean, I think there are different kinds of paradoxes and problems for feminism emerging in the West out of a politics of individualism, but this is the particular crux in the Indian context. So, what does this mean for us in returning to women? I think what it means is, and the implication of this kind of analysis is to say, you can't automatically assume what a woman is. A woman is defined not just in relationship to men. The woman is not just the opposite of what a man is. A woman is defined in relation to many different things, to class, to caste, to gender, to all kinds of things. So it forces us to start thinking that we cannot take women as a priori. So somebody asked the question that what happens when women from ancient times to now have been the subject of violence. On one level, that is true. But on another level, it is assuming that this group that we call women remains the same from ancient times to now, when it actually doesn't. One of the things history is forcing us to do is to say, when do certain moments in politics happen that we can start saying that this is something called women, as opposed to saying this is upper caste, this is Hindu, this is Muslim, this is Dalit. When does that happen? What are the circumstances that make it happen? So if we ask that question, that instead of taking the givenness of women as something granted, something just based on biology, but really think about gender, that, how a person is constructed as a woman depends on various factors at various historical moments. I think if we think in those lines, then we are already forcing ourselves to kind of radically pluralize the meaning of gender and say that gender is not just the perceived social differences between different sexes, but gender, or how one becomes a man or a woman, depends on a variety of different factors. So we get here the possibility then of looking at women and its emergence, when that woman is produced, how it's produced, in relation to various things that we need not mean excluding masculinity, because it would incorporate looking at all of those things at the same time. Eventually, I think what this would do, and this will be the last point, I mean, I would say we would need to kind of really think of women as not a fixed category, but something that is happening or that happens at a particular moment. But the other thing I think this allows us to do is it allows us to see the point of a feminist historiography and its intervention in the scholarship as ever going, that it doesn't come to a stop at a particular moment. So the story of what it's done has been so successful. But I'm saying that there's lots more women's agency that hasn't been acknowledged. So we take today, for example, the idea of political thought, of intellectual history. A lot of that today is still focused mainly on male figures. It's assumed that women leaders, they were social activists, they were literateurs, but they were not intellectuals. They were not producing political thought. Now, if we had accepted the idea of gendered nations, then we cannot have political thought as a preserve of a gender free or of a neutral discourse that just happens to be done all by men. It would force us to say, no, maybe we need to rethink what political thought is and really take seriously these women, not just as activists, but as people who are actually engaged in producing political intellectual thought about nations and nationalism. And finally, I think turning to women allows us to also kind of make what has until now been a largely academic and almost ivory tower discussion around the new ways in which we can think about nationalism into a much more engaged public scholarship as well, where I think the interest in people, in women and what they were doing is much greater than it is in, ignoring and looking only at how discourses and structures kind of make women the objects of their remit, but really focus on what women are producing themselves. So I think in a number of ways there is lots to be gained and lots to be said for looking at women and highlighting women once again in the scholarship and nationalism. But as I said, not in the old way as taking that for granted, but really looking at moments when women as a category becomes significant and when it doesn't and why it doesn't. And really looking at places where we still hold a sort of gender neutral kind of line and breaking that and saying even there's room to expand our gendered understanding of nationalism. So I'm going to end with that and see if there are any other unanswered questions, or if I didn't do a good job addressing some of the questions before, I'd be happy to get back to that. So I have one from Anish. Was why the women from the Dalit community in East Bengal and East Pakistan were being targeted and they had to face violence from the Islamist fanatics despite promise from Jagannath Mandal and Dalit and Muslims share a common brotherhood, bonding, and they are completely different from the caste Hindus, but after 1950s. Really good point, Anish. And I think you're right. I mean, what I was referring to was the moment of partition violence, where and it was mainly on the western border, which was within the Punjab. That's the work of Urvashi Batalia, who argued so there's not decisive work of all partition violence, but certainly in the Punjab, she found that Dalit women were relatively unharmed, unlike Muslim and Hindu women during the partition violence. What you're talking about is actually also post-partition, which is also very interesting because a lot of the Hindus in East Pakistan at that time were Dalits, and so then were these Dalit women being targeted because they were Dalits, or were they being targeted because they were Hindus? That would be an interesting question that I would ask. And I would suggest that it's probably the latter, that in this case, the Dalit women were being targeted because they were representative of Hindus. And you're absolutely right, there was violence. And so the violence on the eastern border was different. It was more prolonged. It was not the spectacular violence around 47. It continues for a longer time in bits and pieces that leads to the sort of migration, slower migration of Hindu communities from eastern Pakistan. But Anish, your question once again reminds me of that's why you want to think of not taking women as already a decided category. So was their womenness important as Hindus or as Dalits could be different at different times. Devapan, your question, Anthony Appiah has reminded that the politics of recognition has to be buffered by a recognition of politics. I think this contradiction lies at the heart of the politics centering around identity. Do you think that the paradox of thinking concerning identity is a fixed point and identity is a relation between self and itself? And how does politicization of the personal problematizes the political as personal or the politics as personal? Ooh, that is an interesting set of questions that you've thrown out. And I think I would want to think a little bit more about that, but I do want to echo Apia's point about the limits of constructing a politics around identity, because the point of politics, and which is why I see myself primarily as a political historian, that the point of politics is precisely to create a new kind of political subjectivity, a new kind of subject of reform. So in when I was talking about, the construction of women as a constituency, I think what I was wanting to argue was that around that moment, what happens is for the first time, women become both the objects and the subjects of social reform. They are not just the grounds, the way in which Lata Mani had argued earlier. They become, and that requires a political rethinking. It requires these elite Hindu and Muslim women to say that, look, besides being Hindu and Muslim, we are also something else. And that is something else is this category of women that kind of cuts across this. I think the personal and the political in this is important. When you are saying, does it problematize the political as personal and politics as personal? I think it does. I mean, people often misunderstand the initial feminist question of the personal as political to mean that only the political is only personal. And I think that's the mistake, because it needs to be, the personal needs to be brought into relation with a domain called the non-personal. But I think the personal politics cannot only be personal. It needs to be much more than that. So may not be a good enough answer, but I hope it opens up some possibilities there. Radhika, earlier, that when men from one community wish to humiliate men from another, they do so by violating the women. However, it can't help but notice that the violation of women is a tactic that's applied near university by people in power, including state forces. Interrogation of state violence towards women more often than not involves sexual violence, which is not the case when it comes to men. And I'm curious as to how such tactic became widespread. I recently read Han Kang's Human Acts, hence the question. And of course, I'm also reminded of Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi. Yeah, good question. It's true that, a lot of violence against women becomes sexual violence. Not always true that violence against men doesn't become sexual violence, because that does too very often. So if you think of, during the War on Terror, the Abu Ghraib prisoners, and the way in which American men and women humiliated the male prisoners, a lot of it was sexual as well. But I take your point that it's true that violation of sexual boundaries with women is much greater than you see in the case of men. But again, in the spirit of what I was trying to say, I think my question would be to answer that by looking at how do we define what is sexual and how that gets defined in a certain way, and what are the implications of that. So, for example, why is a certain kind of violation just considered physical violation, while another kind is considered sexual violation? Meaning, we don't come into the world which says your breasts or your vagina is sexual, while your cheeks or your head is not. That is something that human beings make and decide and do. So in a way, once certain things become sexualized, then the crossing that limit of that, if sexual purity for women is the norm, the patriarchal norm, then the violation of what is considered sexual purity becomes the challenge in the way that it doesn't necessarily for men. So I think that's how I would attempt to answer that, but also keeping in question what we define as sexuality at any particular moment. Santan, in the wake of Spivak's provocation, can the subaltern speak? How do you position women in gender history in its attempt to give voice to the oppressed without reproducing the logic of colonial ventriloquism? Can the very act of archiving subaltern women narratives be read as a continuation of what Gauri Vishwanath calls mask of conquest and epistemological colonization through empathetic listening? Um, Yes and no. I mean, I actually don't often use the term subaltern to talk about women of different kinds of backgrounds. And I'm thinking of somebody like Kamla Visheshwaran's work, who argues that there are two ways in which gender impacts the category of subalternity. So if you think of subalternity as not a sociological group, but as a relational dynamic of power, then the two ways she says it impacts subalternity is first in just thinking of women as a whole as a subaltern group. And subaltern because women as a whole, their agency or their construction is constrained by a certain nationalist discourse that cannot allow them certain kinds of political agency or subjectivity. So in that sense, women as a whole can be a subaltern group. But at the same time, among women as well, there is a difference between, elite women, then she's talking about nationalist participation of women during the nationalist movement, between the way in which, say, elite women would be treated in the jails versus the way in which poor or lower caste women are treated. So there, within the category of women itself, you also would have that relationship of subalternity. So in a way, I would address that question through looking at the different forms of relationship that is being constituted. As far as speaking for women, I mean, I think Spivak does a really good job of kind of making it very clear that you don't speak for because everybody is speaking themselves. What you do is you learn to listen to. And I think listening to is a much more productive way of thinking about what I would like to see when we emphasize women rather than just gender in our understanding of nationalism. There's been a lot of scholarship in recent times on Bengali women's writing in the colonial context. Women at times are perceived to be conformists, reiterating patriarchal ideas and values. Do you think that we need to move beyond the conformity subversion binary and underscore women's subjectivity in the acts of self-articulation? Really interesting point. I think you're right that earlier understanding of subalternity, of resistance and compliance is a bit tired. I agree with you, and I think it would make a lot more sense to think about, how self-articulation, how agency is being used for what purpose, and if we really were to dig into that kind of empirical level of detail, we would really get a much richer sense of what is actually subversion and resistance. Because sometimes, from a certain angle, from a certain perspective, something might look like resistance or might look like subversion, but we may need to question that what is really being seen as subversion or resistance. So I like your emphasis on on kind of self-articulation.
Thank you, ma'am.
Unity,
Absolutely.
good. Unity, you have a question.
Yeah, I had a question. Is there time though?
I'm leaving it to Abhinandita. Is there time?
Yeah, no, definitely. We'll take one last question. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is such an insightful lecture, Professor Sinha. And the point that you ended on, that is something that I also, as a student of gender history, have really struggled with. And I think a lot of like my classmates, all of us who we talk about, when we talk about gender history, we struggle with, which is like, we want to focus on women's self-agency, and that is the question that's always on our minds when we are reading about women, when we're reading gender history. But it's hard to like, at least as like just a bachelor's graduate, I haven't studied that much. It's hard for us to like figure out how we do that, because there's so much writing on women but there's so little by women. And it's just difficult to think about how we do uncover their own voices, how we uncover their own self agency. So if you could possibly shed some light on that, that would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you, Anati. You're right. I mean, there are two problems with returning to women. So, in a way, I'm glad to hear that as young people, you are interested in that question because, in some ways, a lot of people, at least at a certain moment in the historiography, would have said that's an unfashionable question. We've gone beyond that. We don't need to look at what women are saying because women are basic. Most of the time, when you're looking at women's sources, they are from elite women and they're from upper caste women. It doesn't include all women. But interestingly, we don't use that same argument when it comes to men. Because a lot of the writing by men are also by elite men and upper caste men, but we still use that without any problem. But when it comes to women, we often feel that, oh, these are compromised women. These are not women who are worth our time and energy. So I'm really glad that you are raising that question of wanting to see that. But I think your other point is very well taken, that in order to do that well, because if we have only elite male sources largely, it's true that in women's case we do have mainly elite women's sources, but all that's even much less than what we have for men. So there is this problem in terms of just the writings that are available to us. But here is where, as scholars, we need to be more expansive about what we think of as our sources and really look at different kinds of sources where we might be able to construct a different kind of history, whether it's visual material, whether it is material objects, whether it is like looking at sources against the grain, where there may be all male sources, but they can we find in there, can we read them differently to find in there women's self-perceptions, women's agency. So I think a lot of it is changing the way in which we have thought of as, our kind of standard sources that we go to, because there we will probably find very little by women. And it may just reproduce then the marginalization of women from the kind of stories we tell. So to be committed to looking at different kinds of sources, because we are committed to a project of making these women's self-perception, their agency visible, would be a place to start.
Thank you so
Thank
Thank
much.
you,
you,
Anati.
Christina, and Unnati for that question. I was actually going to ask if there's the angle of queering history and when it's going to come in, but thank you so much for that question. We talked about a lot of things. I would like to inform you, Dr. Sinha, that this was one of the most engaging lectures we have had on our platform. We talked about the intervention of feminist historiography, we talked about unification, plurality, violence, pockets of resolution and agency. But I think what we most importantly learned from today's lecture is to question and to listen.
Oh, thank you.
Uh,
That I
yeah,
really enjoyed it.
we really enjoyed your talk. Such an insightful lecture. It made my day. There was not one part in which I was like, "Oh, this is one of the lectures." No, I was like listening intently, and so many questions. I'm so glad. Thank you
Not
so
at
much.
all. Thank you. You guys were a great audience. Thank you very much, everybody, and keep up the good work. I really would love to hear more from the Voices from the Periphery series.
Definitely. I hope we can have you soon another time for another lectures.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. With that, we
Bye,
end today's
everyone.
lecture. Yes. Bye bye.